Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. This is Dylan Golby and welcome to this week's Gear Short. Now, in this video I'm going to talk about a $249 lens that covers the Fujifilm GFX sensor. Now, as we know, medium format lenses can be expensive, and even though Fujifilm's lenses are pretty reasonably priced in the medium format world, a small selection of lenses can quickly add up to a very large bill at the end. And so the lens that we're going to talk about today is about the same price as a good quality filter for one of Fujifilm's own lenses. So let's jump in and see what you get for $249. For the past few weeks, I've been testing a lens by a company called AstrHori. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. I've no hope of getting it right, I don't think. There are far too many consonants in a row for me, but that's my best effort. So they were formerly known as Rockstar lenses, and it seems like this rebranding might be a bit of a push towards a new style of lenses from them. So this lens is a 40mm f5.6 in the Leica M Mount. Now, for anybody who's been around here for a while, you'll know that I don't use any Leica cameras, but AstrHori reached out and they said, hey, this covers the Fujifilm GFX sensor or any other camera with that size sensor. Would you like to give it a go? And so, I was curious and I took them up on their offer. So full disclosure, I was sent this lens for review, but I've not been paid or asked to say anything specific. And so these opinions are my own and have been formed by basically getting out there and spending some time with the lens. Now, I'll be honest and say that I wasn't expecting much. Now, I've seen a few of their extreme budget offerings, sort of, $80 fisheye lenses and things like that. And, I was looking to this lens for more of, the experimentation value than anything else. But it's actually a far better lens than I was expecting. So let's jump in and take a look at how it performs. Now, you might be wondering why I've been holding the box this whole time and not the lens itself. And, well, I wanted to use this to show you guys basically where I had my own biases tested. So, as I said, I wasn't expecting too much from this lens, even having seen the quite amazing MTF chart that the company sent over for me to take a look at. And this box sort of, confirmed that little bias for me in my head. So first we basically have to remove this sheath to reveal the actual box. And then once we get inside, we have this sort of plastic embossed, not wonderful looking Rockstar logo. And then when we go over here, we have the new AstrHori logo. And then we have this sort of diagonal shaped lid here that's, I guess, purely cosmetic. And then we open it up and we get to a piece of foam that's rather hard to get out and pops the cap off the lens there for you. And then I held the lens and basically all of those preconceptions started to fade away. So picking the lens up, I was quite surprised that it felt really solid in the hand while still remaining quite lightweight. And construction is all metal and glass, as we have come to expect from third-party offerings at this price point. Now, this might sound a little strange, but the first thing that I noticed was how well machined the markings on the lens are. So your aperture values, your focus distance, and your depth of field scale. Now, typically I've found that with a lot of these third-party manufacturers, they tend to skimp on this, and you'll usually see sort of, some burn marks or a bit of a poor paint job, but AstrHori, I hope I'm saying that right, have done a fantastic job here, and that told me that, they've probably paid attention to other aspects of the lens that are important as well. Now, the lens design itself is super simple. So much like an old large format lens, basically the entire lens set moves forward and back, just further away from the sensor and closer to the sensor as you twist the focus ring. So there's not any sort of fancy focusing elements like you might find in modern lenses. Now, it doesn't rotate if you happen to want to use a CPL as well. So despite what the manual may have you believe, the aperture ring is actually placed at the front of the lens and the focus ring at the rear. And this is contrary to a lot of modern lenses that have physical aperture rings, like the Fujifilm lenses, and it's tripped me up a couple of times where I've reached for the aperture and ended up changing focus rather than actually changing the aperture. So not a problem, but just something to get used to if you have been using other lenses with physical aperture rings. Now the aperture itself is actually quite an interesting element to this lens. It has 5 straight blades, but when you open it all the way up to f5.6, it moves completely out of the way to reveal a secondary aperture that's sort of a perfectly machined circle, and that's presumably to soften the bokeh up when used wide open. Now turning the lens over, the couplings for Leica's rangefinder mechanism are what looks to be machined brass, and there's a couple of adjustment screws that are easily accessible if the alignment is off. And AstrHori even sent me a jeweler's screwdriver in case I might need to adjust those, but as I don't have a rangefinder, it's not been an issue for me, and I really can't speak to that. In order to mount this to another system, you will of course need a mount adapter, and I was kindly sent this along with the lens, which would allow me to mount it to my GFX. And basically what you'll need to do is line up the 2 red dots as you would any normal lens, give it a twist, and there you go. And then you can basically mount this entire assembly to the GFX. And once it's on there, it's a good idea to head into the menu and register the lens. Since it's a fully mechanical lens with no electronic communication with the body at all, the camera doesn't really know what you've mounted to the body. So you'll want to go into the mount adapter settings so that you can add the lens there. Now, it's a good idea to specify the name of the lens so that it gets saved into the metadata and you know what lens you were using. But most importantly, if you have a body with IBIS, so the GFX 100, 50S2, the 100S, the focal length will basically tell the camera, hey, you know, there's a 40mm lens attached, use that in your IBIS calculations. And so I've been able to get reliably sharp images down to a 15th or a 20th of a second on the 100 megapixel bodies, so it's definitely worth registering that. Now that's about it for the build quality, so let's get into the good stuff. And as we go through the details, I want you to keep in mind that this is a $249 lens that was originally designed for a 35mm sensor or 35mm film rather than the larger GFX sensor. And when it comes to budget lenses, sharpness is one of the areas where I honestly expect them to suffer the most. And with this lens, it was one of the areas that I was actually most surprised. Now, even wide open at f5.6, it produces great contrast and sharpness, and the center of the frame is excellent, and the corners really aren't that far behind, so even on the larger sensor. Now these results might not satisfy the pixel peepers who've bought the GFX system to basically compare micro contrast between lenses or shoot test charts and things like that, but for us mere mortals who just want to make some photographs with our lenses, it does an excellent job. So rather than sort of prattle on about what I think of the sharpness and the detail that this lens produces, here are a few samples from my time working with it, and I've also put a couple of links below so that you can download 100 megapixel files and poke around to your heart's content. Chromatic aberration is another area where I expect budget lenses to suffer quite a bit, but green and purple fringing don't really seem to be an issue with this lens, and I haven't noticed any at all, even in the high contrast scenes that I've tried shooting with it. So it's not something you need to worry about, which is another big surprise from this lens. You may have noticed from the samples that I've shown that there's quite a heavy vignette in the extreme corners. And so while the optical circle of the lens definitely covers that GFX sensor, the extreme corners still vignette quite heavily. And so wide open, it's about a 2.5 stop darkening in the very extreme corners, and that reduces to about 2.2 stops or so by f11, but it never really goes away. And so since there's no profile in software at this point, you'll either need to work pretty hard to remove it manually, as it's not a uniform darkening towards the center of the frame, or you'll need to simply live with it. Now, being careful to compose a little wider when you work is something that you could do, or you could also work with the 35mm format mode in the GFX and crop down to the 35mm sensor, and there'd be no vignette at all, but where's the fun in that? Now back to that aperture. Now, as I mentioned before, there are essentially two physical apertures in this lens, and so the bokeh between f5.6 and f8 is extremely different, and you can see that in action in this night scene. In the first image, the aperture is wide open at f5.6, and you can see that it does form perfect circles, even though they're not the prettiest you'll find. They're not evenly illuminated all the way across. But in the second image, I stopped down to f8. Now here you can see that pentagonal aperture coming in, and from a 40mm lens at f5.6, we don't expect much in terms of bokeh, but it's still there if you want to get in close and make use of, city lights as a background. In a more normal situation though, we end up with reasonably smooth bokeh wide open, and it gets a little bit jittery as the lens is stopped down. But again, no real issues here because it's not really what the lens is designed for. You have to get in very, very close and open that aperture really wide, even to get any sort of semblance of bokeh in the background. The aperture does produce great sunstars though, and wide open, the perfect circle doesn't really do anything interesting to point lights, but once you bring in those 5 perfectly straight aperture blades around f8 and beyond, gorgeous sunstars begin to appear, and they're large, they're sharp-edged, and they definitely call attention to themselves. So if you like that sort of thing, point it at lights, you'll be a happy camper. While I was testing the sunstars at a museum visit with my wife, I noticed some quite intense flare and ghosting from the beam projector that I was using as my point source. Now, when that beam was in the frame, I was getting those beautiful sunstars, but as soon as I moved the camera away and the beam was just outside the frame, I was able to create some fairly interesting flare and ghosting across the image, and it almost started to look like it was raining across the scene. So regular viewers here will know that I love experimenting with the interesting quote-unquote flaws of a lens, and I very quickly was drawn into sort of making something a bit interesting with this lens. And of course, my wife isn't always impressed with my love for waiting on the right combination of projector beam and subjects in the background, and so she spent a little time photographing me in that beam. It's a pretty glamorous life, this lens testing stuff, but here are a couple of images from my camera facing the other way. The 40mm f5.6 has not only been technically excellent, but it's been a really fun lens to use so far. Now, for me, as somebody who usually works with super fast native glass like the GF 110mm f2, it's been a very different experience to walk around with such a wide angle field of view and an aperture of f5.6 all the time. So if we do a quick conversion, this works out to be around a 31 or a 32mm equivalent field of view, which is very close to the 28mm lenses that I often worked with on my Nikon SLRs. And so that field of view was, somewhat familiar to me, but working with such a deep depth of field by default was quite interesting and a bit of a challenge. Now, in terms of optical quality, I was really impressed by sharpness, the lack of color fringing, and as you probably noticed, I really enjoyed working with the flare and ghosting that the lens can do. And anybody who's spent some time on this channel will know that I love a sunstar, and so those big, beautiful sunstars are going to find their way into a few of my images from now on. Now, since this is a review, I do have to nitpick a little, and so I wish that the image circle were just a little larger so that the corners were basically free to be used. Now, I understand that this lens was designed for the smaller format of the Leica cameras, but since it does cover the sensor, it would have been really great if it was able to basically cover that entire frame and use it easily. So, who would I recommend this lens for? Well, if you'll be using it on the GFX or the Hasselblad systems, I'd say given the wide field of view and the maximum aperture of f5.6, it's a great lens for landscape or street or even some environmental portraiture. Things like this where the edge-to-edge sharpness or the edge-to-edge detail can be more important than, say, depth of field or light gathering, where this lens is really going to shine. So on smaller formats, it might work better as a street lens or, on an APS-C camera, maybe as a portrait lens. So overall, I'd say it's absolutely worth the asking price of $249, and it would be a great lightweight addition to your kit. As always, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you have, I'd really appreciate it if you could give it a thumbs up. And also, just let me know what you think of this lens in the comments below. Is it something that you would consider adding to your kit? And if so, what system do you use, and how do you see yourself using it?